In the bustling heart of Greenwood Park, where the air was filled with the joyful sounds of families at play and the mouth-watering aromas of food vendors, a heartwarming scene quickly turned into a distressing ordeal driven by prejudice and misunderstanding. Malik, a devoted black father, was enjoying a day with his adopted white daughter, Ella. Their bond was undeniable as they laughed and played, their joy an infectious part of the park's atmosphere. However, when a concerned but prejudiced woman named Mrs. White misunderstood their interaction, her actions set off a chain of events that would challenge her and the community's perceptions deeply. Greenwood Park was a vibrant hub of community activity, where every weekend, families gathered to enjoy the lively ambience. Children's laughter blended with the cheerful barks of dogs, and the aroma of food from nearby vendors filled the air. It was a place where city life paused briefly to savor moments of leisure and connection. Malik, a black man in his late 30s with a kind demeanor and an easy smile, was a familiar figure in this idyllic scene. Today, he spent his afternoon with Ella, his 6-year-old adopted daughter. Her mop of unruly blonde curls bounced as she ran, and their bond was palpable. They chased each other around the playground, Malik never far behind Ella's speedy zigzagging paths. Their laughter was a clear sign of their deep familial love and joy in each other's company. Observing from a nearby bench was Mrs. White, in her early 50s, a regular at community events from school fundraisers to neighborhood watches. She took pride in her role as a community guardian, but her sense of duty sometimes crossed into overzealousness due to her unexplored prejudices. Today, something about the sight of Malik and Ella playing together struck a chord of concern within her. Instead of seeing a father and daughter enjoying a beautiful day, she saw an unusual pairing that did not fit her narrow expectations of what a family should look like. Her perception, clouded by bias, set the stage for actions driven by misunderstanding and fear. As Malik and Ella engaged in a lively game of tag, their laughter a delightful sound against the backdrop of chatting families and playful dogs, Ella's blonde curls flew as she maneuvered with surprising agility. Her laughter rang clear as she evaded Malik's playful attempts to catch her. The game took a sudden turn when Ella, looking back to tease her father with a playful grin, didn't see the raised root of an old oak tree. Her foot caught, and she tumbled to the ground with a startled cry that sliced through the ambient noise of the park. Instantly, the laughter stopped, replaced by the sharp, concerned tones of a child in distress. Malik's reaction was immediate. He dashed to her side, scooping her up into his arms with a gentle efficiency that spoke to countless similar moments of minor childhood accidents. His voice was soothing as he checked her for injuries, his large hands gentle as he brushed away tears and dirt from her face. From her vantage point, Mrs. White's observation turned to concern. Her initial amusement at their game darkened as she interpreted the scene through a lens marred by deep-seated stereotypes and unexamined fears. The sight of Ella's tears and Malik's urgent care conjured a narrative in Mrs. White's mind disconnected from the loving father-daughter dynamic before her. Driven by a misguided sense of duty, Mrs. White reached for her phone with trembling hands. The whispers of prejudice told her she was witnessing something sinister, an assumption fueled more by the colors she saw than the context she misunderstood. As Mrs. White dialed the police, her actions set in motion a chain of events that would challenge her perceptions and force her to confront the biases that had shaped her response. She watched intently as Malik tenderly consoled Ella, his large hands delicately patting her back, and his voice a soothing balm. Despite the clear signs of a loving father comforting his hurt child, Mrs. White's perception was colored by stereotypes and a narrow understanding of family dynamics that didn't align with what she saw. To her, the image of a black man with a white child in distress evoked a story far removed from the reality before her. As Malik reassured Ella, promising her treats and gently checking her scraped knee, Mrs. White's internal conflict intensified. Part of her recognized the innocence of their interaction, noticing other parents nearby offering sympathetic smiles towards Malik, acknowledging a scene they too were familiar with. Yet another part, the one tainted by societal conditioning and unchallenged preconceptions, whispered doubts and warnings. Her hands gripped her phone tightly, the device a potential catalyst for action in a scenario she didn't fully understand. She thought of her own children, the protective instincts that had always guided her, and wondered if she would appreciate a stranger's intervention if their roles were reversed. Yet the what-ifs loomed large in her mind, driven by horror stories and sensational news segments that often painted men like Malik as figures of suspicion. Mrs. White glanced around, seeking either validation or a reason to dismiss her fears from the faces of other parkgoers. She found a mixture of disinterest and mild curiosity, none mirroring the alarm she felt. Her heart raced as she grappled with the decision, the weight of potential outcomes pressing down on her. Finally, her sense of duty, however misguided, overpowered her reservations. She dialed 911, her voice slightly quivering as she spoke with the dispatcher. "There's a man here who I believe might be harming a little girl," she reported, her eyes never leaving Malik and Ella. She described Malik, her language unintentionally laced with bias, painting him more as a suspect than a concerned parent. As she hung up, a wave of anxiety washed over her. Mrs. White wondered if she had done the right thing, the seeds of doubt continuing to grow even as she watched the police approach. She stood there, frozen by the unfolding events, her internal turmoil a stark contrast to the calming reassurances Malik continued to offer his daughter. The sound of sirens subtly pierced the normal hum of the park, growing louder as two police cars pulled up to the curb. Malik, still comforting Ella, looked up with a mix of confusion and concern. He set Ella gently on her feet, holding her close as the officers approached. Ella, sensing the seriousness of the situation, gripped Malik's hand tightly, her earlier calm replaced by growing apprehension. As the police officers made their way through the park, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The lightheartedness drained away, replaced by an air of tension and curiosity. Bystanders, drawn by the arrival of the police, began to gather around, forming an uneasy crowd. Whispers and speculative glances were exchanged as everyone tried to piece together the scene unfolding before them. One of the officers, a stern-looking man with a notepad ready, addressed Malik directly. "Sir, we received a call about a potential situation involving this child. Can you explain your relationship to her?" His tone, though professional, carried an underlying suspicion that made Malik's heart sink. Malik maintained his composure, though his voice betrayed a slight tremor. "Officer, this is my daughter, Ella. I adopted her 3 years ago." He tried to keep the situation light for Ella's sake, squeezing her hand in reassurance, but the gravity of the accusation weighed heavily on him. He reached into his pocket with his free hand, pulling out his wallet to show pictures and adoption papers that he carried for just such unforeseen situations. Ella, overwhelmed by the growing crowd and the serious men questioning her father, started to whimper, burying her face in Malik's leg. Malik stroked her hair, his protective instincts fully triggered as he continued to explain their situation to the officers. The police, upon reviewing the documents and listening to Malik's calm yet firm explanation, began to ease their demeanor. However, the initial coldness of their approach had already sown seeds of discomfort among the onlookers, many of whom now looked on with a mix of guilt and embarrassment. Mrs. White, from a distance, watched the exchange with increasing unease. Seeing the documents and witnessing the bond between Malik and Ella, she started to realize the magnitude of her mistake. The scene she had interpreted so wrongly now unfolded with a clarity that filled her with regret. As the officers started to wrap up their questioning, acknowledging the misunderstanding, Mrs. White felt a profound sense of remorse for the distress she had caused to an innocent family. The police officers, having scrutinized the adoption papers and photos Malik provided, acknowledged their validity with a nod. They lowered their notebooks and exchanged a glance, signaling a shift in their approach. However, despite the confirmation of Malik's story, the mood remained charged, the crowd's murmuring increasing, a mixture of relief and residual suspicion lingering in the air. Malik, feeling the weight of public scrutiny, kept his arm around Ella, who remained close to his side, visibly shaken by the ordeal. His voice steady but firm, he addressed the officers and the onlookers. "I always carry these documents, not because I think I should have to prove my relationship with my daughter, but because I know situations like this can arise." The police, sensing the tension and the need to defuse the situation, attempted to reassure Malik and the crowd. One officer, speaking louder so others could hear, said, "We appreciate your cooperation, sir. We're sorry for the inconvenience, but we have to respond to calls with due diligence." His tone was apologetic, yet the underlying implication that such checks were routine did little to ease the discomfort. Ella, still clinging to Malik, looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. Malik reassured her with a gentle squeeze of her shoulder, whispering that everything was okay. But his gaze across the gathered faces reflected his frustration and hurt. His words to the officers carried a weight that resonated with some in the crowd, who now looked sheepish, realizing the role their silent assumptions may have played in escalating the incident. Mrs. White, who had initiated the call to the police, stood at the edge of the gathering, her initial resolve crumbling under the weight of her misguided actions. The reality of seeing a family subjected to such scrutiny because of her call filled her with remorse. She stepped forward hesitantly, compelled by a growing sense of guilt to make amends. As the police wrapped up, ensuring there were no further concerns and reminding the crowd to be more discerning in future incidents, Malik took a deep breath, preparing to address Mrs. White and the rest of the onlookers. He recognized this as a teachable moment, not just for his and Ella's sake, but for the community's understanding and growth. The officers left, and the crowd began to disperse, but the echoes of what had just transpired lingered. Mrs. White approached Malik slowly, her steps uncertain, her apology ready but unsure of its reception. Malik, seeing her approach, readied himself for a conversation he knew was necessary, not just for his and Ella's sake, but for the community's understanding and growth. With Ella still by his side, Malik turned to face Mrs. White as she approached. The remaining onlookers, sensing the gravity of the personal exchange about to unfold, gave them space but listened intently. Mrs. White's expression was fraught with regret, her earlier certainty replaced by doubt and shame. "I want to explain something," Malik began, his voice steady but filled with an underlying strain from the ordeal. "I became Ella's father not just out of a desire to be a dad, but because her biological parents couldn't provide her with the safety and love she needed. They were in a very dark place, struggling with issues that made their home unsafe and toxic." He paused, ensuring that Ella was distracted with a small toy from his pocket, sparing her the harsher truths of her past. "When the opportunity came to give Ella a stable home, I didn't think twice. I knew what she needed was a chance for a normal, happy life, something her biological parents, due to their abusive and toxic behaviors, couldn't offer her." Malik's words flowed with a mixture of sadness and firmness, educating Mrs. White and the onlookers on the complexities behind many adoptions. It's not just about rescuing a child. It's about providing what every child inherently deserves: security, love, and a nurturing environment. That's what I strive to give her every single day. Mrs. White listened, her eyes moistening as she absorbed the gravity of her misunderstanding and the depth of Malik's commitment to his daughter. The reality of her prejudice against this devoted father, based solely on his appearance and her preconceived notions, weighed heavily on her. "I'm so sorry," she finally murmured, her voice barely audible. "I misunderstood what I saw. I thought I was helping, but I didn't see the whole picture. I just jumped to a conclusion without thinking." Malik nodded slowly, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. White. It's important to recognize how quickly situations can be misjudged, especially when biases cloud our judgment. We all have a lot to learn about compassion and understanding." His words not only addressed Mrs. White but served as a lesson to the bystanders, reminding everyone of the dangers of snap judgments and the need for empathy in a community. Mrs. White stepped back, giving Malik and Ella space, her stance humble and reflective. As the crowd dispersed, a new sense of understanding began to take root among them, sparked by the ordeal Malik and Ella faced and the dignified manner in which they handled the misunderstanding. Malik took Ella's hand, ready to leave the park, the day's events leaving a bittersweet feeling but also a hopeful glimpse into the potential for personal growth and community healing. In the weeks that followed, Greenwood Park returned to its usual lively self, but the memory of the incident lingered. Malik and Ella continued to visit, their presence a gentle reminder of the lessons learned that day. Families who had witnessed the event became more mindful, and conversations about bias and understanding became more frequent in the community. Mrs. White, too, changed. She volunteered at a local community center, working to bridge gaps and foster a more inclusive environment. Her experience with Malik and Ella had profoundly impacted her, and she was determined to make amends through positive action. For Malik and Ella, life went on. Their bond grew stronger, fortified by the challenges they had faced together. Malik knew that the world could be unkind, but he also believed in the power of education and empathy. He became more involved in community events, sharing his story to raise awareness and promote understanding. Through his efforts, Greenwood Park gradually transformed into a place where differences were celebrated, and the true meaning of family was understood by all. The story of Malik and Ella's ordeal, and the subsequent growth and reflection it inspired, became a cherished part of Greenwood Park's history. It was a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the importance of challenging our prejudices. As time went on, the park continued to be a haven of joy and connection, a place where families of all shapes and colors could come together and thrive. Malik and Ella's presence remained a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that understanding and compassion could pave the way for a brighter, more inclusive future.